Thank you very much. Minister Sanner, Mayor of Drammen, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today on this beautiful morning in Norway. It's the first time that I'm in your country, and I cannot think of a better opportunity to link that to talking about the future of our cities and the future of building. I'm going to speak to you about going green, how cities are leading the next economy. And as you've just heard, the main thrust of the argument is that we're moving now away from talking about green policies, particularly in cities, as something that is simply good for the environment, to something where we recognize that it's precisely those policies that enable much broader societal goods and, in particular, advantages to the economy. Now, as you just heard, I'm representing a research center at the London School of Economics, LSE Cities, and my hosts asked me to very briefly say what kind of work we do to give you a bit of context. So on that, we are working in three main areas of research that cuts across questions of societies and cities, then very important for today, the environment and cities, and a third large area on urban governance. Our work is unusually applied. So while we do our sort of academic work, we have, I think, a core mission to engage with policymakers, with practitioners, and really sort of be part of changing the practice of city making. We're probably most well known for the Urban Age program, a global program which we have been running now for 11 years, jointly with Deutsche Bank's Alfred Herrhausen Society, a series of conferences around the world investigating the future of cities, but attaching to that very centrally an engagement again with policymaking, research, and urban practitioners. So let me come to my talk this morning, and I have structured this into three distinct parts. I'll speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have some questions attached to the presentation. I will begin with giving you a sense of the role of cities as first movers and how they are in some ways leading the transition towards sort of a new socio-technical regime. I'm then going to speak specifically about policy sectors where cities are making a difference. That's often not very obvious how, in fact, cities are constrained to focus on certain areas, and they're better in certain areas than in others, and I'll give you a sense of that. And then I probably come to the crucial bit around cities as placemakers. If there's one competence cities do have where they're better than any other tier of government, it is with regards to the shaping of the physical environments, and that is ultimately where a lot of the policies come together across the different sectors. Now, before getting to those three areas, let's just rehearse the big picture argument around global urbanization and around, of course, the role of cities in a global economy. You're probably familiar to these figures. Cities are all about the concentration of activity, the concentration of people on less than half a percentage point of the land surface of the world. We have more than 50% of the world population. Now, that's relatively well known. What's often less well known is that within those areas, we concentrate 80%, so disproportionately, 80% of economic output. That's the reason why any country that is transitioning towards a high-income context will have to urbanize, will have to bring people to city, take advantage of the massive economic advantages of being closer together. And I'll say more about that throughout my presentation. Now, unfortunately, the process of urbanizing over the last, you could even say 150, 200 years, has been one that has compromised on the environment. It has been very good for well-being, it has been good for health, for progress, and broader notions of prosperity, but it's indirectly linked to a whole range of environmental bads. I'm showing you here various growth curves, and it's important that we consider growth not per se as something problematic, but that we celebrate positive growth around, I mentioned before, health, education, prosperity. But clearly, for a finite planet, there are growth curves, and some of them you'll find here, which are hugely problematic. Resource use, carbon emissions, pollution. And within the next generation, or our current generation, we will start bending these curves and do something which economists refer to as the decoupling of good growth from the bad growth we no longer can afford. And that process will be disruptive, and it will be very much led by cities. And that's sort of what I'm mainly talking about. Before, two areas I should highlight that are specifically important about sort of the building of cities, areas which we often don't reflect enough about. The first is about the embedded energy demand and the embedded emissions that result from simply constructing buildings and cities. So not only the operations, but just constructing buildings. So if we're looking at this, in fact, is a sort of very sad reference where we're realizing that rather than decoupling, we're doing the opposite. We're actually using more and more energy to get relatively little economic output. So if we're seeing here worldwide cement production, over the last, or since 1990, has actually surpassed the growth in global GDP by some 70 percentage points. That's a troubling story. And it's getting even more troubling if we're thinking about embedded carbon emissions. If we simply continue building cities as we have done it so far, the predictions are that within a sort of very short time, we will increase the global carbon emissions by 13 times what is the emission in 2012. So only by continuing building, using the steel and the concrete as we've done it so far, we will already be challenged in meeting the 2-degree centigrade objective. So we really need to have a big U-turn on the construction side itself. We also need to talk about land take of cities. Urbanization is very, very intensive at the moment when it comes to land take. We are in a period of only 30 years where the global land, the global urban land, is predicted to increase threefold. This is only from 2000 to 2030. Managing this urban expansion, ideally reducing it, is probably one of our biggest responsibilities. So with that, let me come to the survey, which I'm going to build on and make my main arguments around. We interviewed a few years back in the run-up of Rio+20 about 100 cities worldwide, asking them about how they experience this bringing together of economic policymaking and green policymaking. And we looked at about 8 cities in greater detail, where we spoke to local officials, where we did a lot of data research to also verify the broad macro story which we were able to gather through the big, broad overview. So what I'm going to do is now always give you sort of big teaser pictures of the macro story, but then also go deep into specific case study cities and experiences on the ground. And with that, to my first overview on cities as first movers, to basically give you a sense that this idea of pioneering cities is not just a cliche, it's actually happening. We have relatively robust data on the decoupling, yes, of economic growth, of prosperity, and at least sort of local emission impacts for a range of cities. I'm using here a few examples. These are wonderful sort of decoupling curves. What you see here in gray is in all of those cities a considerable increase in traditional economic growth and population increase, and at the same time a real improvement using different sort of indicators on the environmental front. An extreme case is Copenhagen, with a considerable reduction of carbon emissions, which is actually not unique to that city. We have done detailed work in Stockholm, similar story, and as far as I know, Oslo is not that different either. So here from 93 to 2011, we have an increase of the city's economic output by almost 40%, and over the same period of time, a reduction of the carbon emissions to 70%. Now, we need to be careful here. A lot of this is linked to deindustrialization and simply outsourcing the emissions. So that's one part of the story which we need to tackle. But at the same time, we also know that from building retrofits, from dealing with our transport systems, these are very real emission saving, which will help us enormously in the future. And Mark Watts will talk more about the pathways which cities will develop in the future, helping with this equation. Another sort of interesting overview is just to debunk this myth that there's a trade-off between green and economic prosperity. What you see here for sort of major European cities is a chart mapping the economic output on the horizontal and the green city index, as it was defined by Siemens a few years back, on the vertical. And as you can see here, if anything, there is a positive relationship between the two. Now, it's very hard to tell, and this is the chicken and egg problem, whether cities are green because they are prosperous or they are prosperous because they are green. It's probably a mix of both. But the main story here is we are not seeing those trade-offs which a lot of people would want us to believe in. So here, first, direct overview on the survey. What you see here is the response of different cities. Anything that to these subjects responds positive is highlighted in a shade of yellow. Sort of the more negative ones are in gray, and then we rank the results by sort of what was most positive to the least positive. And here, the question about green progress. Where have these roughly 100 cities been successful in achieving green policies? It's the low-hanging fruit, of course, of green space provision, of recycling, of composting, water pollution. These have been addressed rather successfully in the majority of those cities. The big ones, greenhouse gas emission, energy security, resource consumption, are, of course, still to be tackled, and we also know where the problem lies here. A lot of it to do with also national and international frameworks. Another bigger question we asked was about the trigger of these policies, of these green and economic policies. And in an interesting way, we here have a combination, and this is unique to cities, of public opinion driving a lot of this stuff, together with political leadership. In fact, there are very few cities where you will find progressive policies that are not linked to a name. And some of these names are in the room. Jeanette Sadikan will speak later to you about her experience in New York. And that is a very unique situation in cities where the combination of public opinion with leadership can really lead to a more transformative change. So the progressiveness of cities is something which we can capture. Another area where cities are very good at is to become a broker of convening very different stakeholders. This is an overview of a rather complex matrix and network of collaborators that are currently delivering in Berlin the so-called electric vehicle and e-mobility revolution. And it's very confusing, but the reality is that cities are better positioned than probably most other tiers of government to bring these players together, to allow them to have a focused area where they intervene, where they have regular meetings, and most importantly, where often they use the general public as those people that are trialing new ideas and reporting back, and therefore you have a very interesting new innovation cycle. So the convening power of cities is something which is a very significant advantage. So let me move on to my second point around policy sectors where cities are really making a difference. And I'll step here back for a moment using a slightly older chart by the IPCC, looking at where there is, for the case of carbon emissions, the real big potential. This is globally, not only for cities. Which are the big sectors? Just to make one point, the session you're going to have later on buildings is exactly the right one. Clearly, this is the area where a lot of things are happening, where, again, we have low-hanging fruits. The costs are relatively little in terms of bringing carbon emissions down. But there are other sectors, transport in particular, I'll come back to that, which while the cost equation at the moment doesn't look as good, this is the real make and break of the climate story, because we are struggling to bring the emissions down in transport in particular. But here, just to highlight the buildings and also to give you some sense of how we, with our work with the United Nations Environment Programme, have used a lot of good research that has been prepared before. It's a well-known story about the actual financial, the economic benefits of going green. Katz, at that point, calculated that per square meter of a green building, and this is now US dollars, you actually, over a 20-year period, have a return in net present value of between 500 and 700 US dollars. Interestingly, the main return is not related to saving energy. It's actually in relation to something else, which is about the productivity at the workplace, the quality of life, issues which are normally very hard to capture. Capturing these benefits is, in essence, the bigger challenge than actually these benefits existing. They are very real, they do exist, and I think it's part of the business model question where we're struggling to incorporate them appropriately. I said transport is a problem. That's the chart which I usually use to make that point. It's the EU27, at the time 27 member state perspective, carbon emissions from 1990 to 2006, highly urbanized context, so we're talking about mainly cities, and a context where arguably around the world the ambition to reduce carbon emissions have been greatest. You see some progress for energy, households, and industry, but it's transport that's going through the roof. This is really the make and break, as I said before, of the climate story. The good news is cities are well positioned to make a massive difference to that sector. Now, cities are often positioned as a context where the policy making across sectors can really benefit from collaboration and a much greater cross-sectoral integration. While that is true, and it's particularly true for planning, when we surveyed those cities, we still were able to really get a lot of clear information quite contained within those sectors. So be with me for a moment. I will now talk about the specific progress in these sectors and also how we were sort of reported back with information on what was successful and what was less successful. Before going there, a very important test case about how cities can actually intervene in those contexts is about their actual power. And let me illustrate that with a nice comparison here. This is the world's largest solar thermal energy plant, Andasol, in southern Spain. It happens to be a project by an urban government. In fact, an urban government that is 2,000 kilometers northeast from where this has been built. It's the city of Munich, with its publicly owned utility company, that has initiated that project as part of its strategic drive to become carbon neutral with regards to electricity provision by 2025. That's one extreme, where a city becomes almost a global player in the energy space because it owns entirely 100% its utility company, which is a major player in the German and European energy market. There are other extremes. This is the London Array Wind Park. It's the largest in Europe, but besides its name, has nothing to do with direct London policy, because the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority have very little to say about that level of energy policy making. So what we have here, in fact, is the European Union, the UK's government, and then a large consortium of global corporates that are building this. And they use the term London because it's a bloody good name and it helps you to promote these kind of projects, but nothing to do with the city directly. In fact, we have done a lot of research that looks specifically at where do cities actually have a say, which sectors are leading urban sectors. What you see here are sort of classic areas of intervention or policy making, and then anything in red is sort of more city-related, whether it's at the metropolitan level or at the city level or borough level. Anything in grey is usually higher tiers of government. And you get a very clear hierarchy if you look across the board with, of course, massive variances between cities. Spatial planning, culture, utility, transport, classic urban sectors. This is where cities are leading. By contrast, it's more difficult to expect for cities to lead on broad environmental policy, economic development, interesting, education and health. We need to keep those broad issues in mind. So let's move on to one area where innovation has been massive and where cities have been celebrated probably more than in any other area, and that is urban transport. A classic urban area, and I don't even have to superimpose the names of those cities because often they are so much talked about across the world, in the general media, in TV programs. It's also something which relates so much to our daily experience in these cities, whether as tourists or as residents, that we just know about it. And that is good news, because a lot of these projects not only make a difference in the city where they are taking place, but they have been stolen as an idea, they are scaled elsewhere and are replicating themselves at an enormous speed. And we're just seeing now the scaling of a lot of those interventions. At the same time, and I say urban transport, a very urban sector, if you look more detailed into the transport sector, it's very multi-scalar and very sort of multi-level governance. There are many cities where, particularly when it comes to big infrastructure spending, entirely rely on their national governments. There are other cities which are told by their states they can't do congestion charging. So this is an issue which we need to consider. While, yes, mayors can do a big difference, it's often the frameworks, the national frameworks, that allow them to be that innovative. We then asked the question, which are the sectors where those cities are seeing really the opportunity of bringing together the economy issue, breeding local economies and fostering economic growth, and at the same time going green. And that's, you heard it before, where transport, energy and buildings comes absolutely first. And we also asked about what kind of technologies are actually associated with particularly the local innovation that then is scaled and is sort of internationally applied. In transport, it's intelligent traffic management, integrated transport systems, the mobile phone apps, which I hope by now we all use. In energy, it's of course distributed energy and the smart grids, and in energy, in buildings, the building control system and energy efficiency. Now, these lists were very, very long, but those are really the headline figures, which 2 years ago cities felt this is where they really locally breeding technologies, which they not only apply for their own context, but where they hope that it leads to industry that is applied and used more internationally. So, to come to my last point, you already saw that the spatial planning expertise is sort of particular. It seems to be very much led by cities. And it's fair to suggest that cities, more than any other governmental context, is probably in charge of shaping our physical environments. And that is good news. It's great news that this sort of dimension is in the hands of more progressive leaders because it has enormous long-term implications. We asked the question about what are the big policy tools around sort of going green. Development planning comes first, and then public awareness, standards and regulations sort of at a similar level. Again, all of this incredibly useful to shape the physical environment, or in fact directly related to it. And then there's the question about the capabilities. No surprise here. Number one that was ranked by the cities as in their internal capability of dealing with different things was, again, urban planning. This is so fantastically good news because the shaping of our physical environments has enormous long-term lock-in effects. And whether the future of our cities will look more like this, Hong Kong, walkable, public transport-oriented, or like this, the periphery of Mexico City, is of course a choice, which is an artificial choice, and I'm making a point here, but the sort of in its shades is a choice which you are facing in your cities and which has a massive impact of what we can actually do in the long run in greening our economy. One example, transport. And now using two cities which are at a similar wealth level, you could argue, also appreciated by their residents for similar quality of life, although, a very different type of quality of life. Atlanta, on the one hand, and Berlin on the other, also very similar in population size. The way these cities work is uncomparable almost. You see, first in black, the footprint of the built-up land, and superimposed in red, the public transport infrastructure. Of course, a massive difference. Now, where this story becomes really interesting is when you talk about the choice people actually have in terms of traveling in these cities. Less than 10% in Atlanta travel by public transport, walk, or cycle, and that is a share that in Berlin is almost at 70%. Now, that is not only a choice, a form of freedom which Berliners have and maybe people in Atlanta don't have, but directly translates to the energy equation. Now, we have done very interesting work for the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, estimating the subsidy or the externalities which are related very specifically to the context of US-American sprawl. And this is a conservative figure, $400 billion US dollars per year. In fact, this ranges even to beyond $1 trillion US dollars per year. These are costs related to operating these sort of very sprawling environments, infrastructure costs, health costs, accident costs, all the way down to even social costs in terms of what it means running families in these different contexts. So that's a big health warning. At the same time, we also know how much we can save in the future, particularly if we consider the massive infrastructure spending gap. Not a country like Norway might have, but if we're talking to India, if we're talking to China, these are issues that do matter. And we estimate that we can save over the next 15 years something in the region of $3 trillion US dollar if we were to move towards a more compact, connected, and coordinated form of urban growth. So to finish on this point, I wanted to highlight that actually this is where we then go back to our economists and we're talking about the core asset of the cities around sort of this compactness and density. I use here the example of 3 cities which are world finance centers, London, New York, and Hong Kong, and showing you the workplace density. That's an old story, well understood. Finance at that scale needs to be very close together, very compressed, 150,000 people per square kilometer working together, helping this global economy. And it's not only just the finance jobs themselves, but all the sort of the surrounding services that cluster and take advantage of these enormous densities. What is new is that we're discovering that this dynamic not only is important for the context of finance, but in fact might be important for a whole range of different industry. Most importantly, the tech industry, which is currently so much promoted in many cities, very much so in London as well, where another question becomes more radical and interesting: the connection between workplace densities and residential densities. In fact, there are strong arguments which argue that we need to bring those more together, create sort of an ecosystem, a breeding ground of innovation where living and working no longer is as connected, and where certainly London's residential densities are too low. That's understood in London, and the interventions are, before I get there, this is just an image I took 15 years ago around Brick Lane in East London. At the time, no one understood that this was going to be the breeding ground of what's now often referred to as the Silicon Valley of Europe. It's the tech industry in East London that will have to really help with the London economy in the future. This is the image how London has responded. We are densifying the city over the last 10 years. Most of the efforts have been attached to inner city development. The accessibility we are generating through that is enormous. But I'm also introducing here two Scandinavian cities, Copenhagen and Stockholm, to say, don't underestimate those comparably medium-sized cities. They often have public transport accessibility at the scale of even Hong Kong, in the case of Stockholm. And then finally, this image to tell you that the story around how cities really matter as part of this global equation of going green, of dealing with our climate, is only now resonating with national leaders. You see here the launch at the United Nations of our Going Better Growth, Better Climate report, where former Mexican President Felipe Calderón hands over this report to Ban Ki-moon. When we started the work, the classic sectors of macroeconomists around energy, forestries, agriculture were the big ones. When we ended the work in September last year, it was cities that really entered the news headline and makes a lot of those national leaders speak about cities more than ever before. And we will see that in Paris, very much supported also by the work, of course, we'll hear from Mark later, and others that are pushing cities into that space. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Philipp Rode, for the pioneering work you're leading at London School of Economics, and also for this very, very inspiring talk. But tell me, usually money talks. People listen when economists speak. But do you think that's also do you have the impression that this is also the case when you say that eco-districts and eco-friendly infrastructure are among the key drivers of the new economy? I mean, in Oslo, and also Stockholm, in your cases, still plans for and invests heavily in infrastructure for motorized individual transport. And our cities, in the streets in our cities, are still dominated by cars. How come? When economists tell us we should do the opposite.
So, very good question. I think, the first thing to say, I'm not an economist. I'm from the London School of Economics, but I love engage with economists, and it's one of the questions I often have for them. And they would usually respond that it's all to do a bit with the boundary you draw around your cost-benefit analysis, or also your broader sort of macroeconomic analyses. All I can say is that, of course, we had a strong tradition of road building. There is also, all sorts of entrenched interests, and I would say what you describe in Oslo happening is maybe a bit of a hangover of a period which, yes, also scaled these skills and created large companies which very much were targeting this kind of urban development. And we're now first starting to, have certain intellectual arguments, start having these niche experiences where real experiences in cities prove the opposite, that actually you don't need that kind of investment. And I think now the latest stage, and this is something which is only happening now, is that even sort of the macroeconomists working at the level of a country advising national governments on, how much road building they should do. Acknowledge they need to be very careful with this message of, in Africa, in India, that road building is the solution to economic growth. There are areas where clearly it is, connecting cities, making sure that goods movement is established. But when it comes to the interior space of urban environments, building your highways, I think is increasingly accepted as counterproductive also in economic terms.
Very good answer.
Thank you.
Okay, you'll be back on stage in a little while for further elaboration and be part of the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep.